The screams inside Berkeley Castle did not sound human. They tore through the stone corridors, ragged, guttural, filled with a terror young Prince Edward had never heard from any living creature. The guards insisted it was just the wind clawing through the arrow slits, but Edward knew better. He felt the truth in his bones. Something monstrous was happening behind the locked doors of the tower, and the men who barred his way wouldn't meet his eyes. Tonight, his father, King Edward II, was dying. Edward had been smuggled into the castle under cover of darkness, disguised in a hooded cloak too large for his 13-year-old frame. Rain drenched the wool and seeped cold into his skin. Beside him strode Sir William Montague, one of the few men the prince still trusted. Even so, Montague's jaw was tight, his hand hovering near his sword as though expecting danger in every shadow. "Highness," Montague whispered, slowing near the base of the tower, "we shouldn't linger. The Queen must not learn you were here." Edward clenched his fists inside his sleeves. Mother. He hardly recognized Isabella anymore. She had been warm once, protective. Now she moved like a figure carved from ice, calm, untouchable, eyes unreadable. And beside her always lurked Roger Mortimer, who spoke to Edward with a smile sharp enough to cut. "I need to hear him," Edward said, "just once more." But the screams had gone silent. The sudden stillness chilled him more than the rain ever could. Montague's grip tightened on Edward's shoulder. "Your father would not want you in this place." It was too late. A heavy oak door scraped open above them. Two castle guards emerged carrying a long bundle wrapped in dark cloth. They descended the stairway in slow, reverent steps, yet one man's face had gone pale as chalk. He made the mistake of looking at the young prince. Edward did not blink. The guard hesitated, bowed stiffly, and continued downward. But the brief exchange told Edward everything. His father was dead. Not in battle, not in accident, dead by design. Murdered. Queen Isabella would grieve publicly. Mortimer would stand behind her, hand upon his heart, swearing he had fought to the last to protect the king. And Edward would be crowned, a child king placed neatly on a throne built of lies. A cold, sharp rage sparked inside him, brighter than grief. It would burn for years. "Highness," Montague murmured, pulling him away from the stair, "we must return to Gloucester before dawn." Edward followed without speaking. The path to the stables was slick with mud, the night thick with the scent of wet straw and horse sweat. When they reached their mounts, Montague swung the prince into the saddle with practiced efficiency, but Edward noticed his knight's hands were shaking. "This isn't over," Edward whispered. Montague's dark eyes flicked upward. "No, my prince, it has only just begun." The coronation took place a month later, but its splendor could not disguise the rot beneath it. Westminster Abbey glittered with gold cloth and scarlet banners, yet every nobleman present knew the truth. They weren't witnessing the rise of a monarch, but the triumph of a revolution led by the Queen and her lover. Edward's crown felt heavy, far heavier than he expected for a boy who dreamed of heroic kings since childhood. The circlet of gold pressed into his temples as Bishop Stapleton's voice rose in solemn cadence, echoing through the vaulted hall. "Behold your rightful sovereign, Edward III, by the grace of God, King of England, Lord of Ireland." Edward scanned the assembled lords and knights. Some bowed deeply, others lowered only their heads, cautious rather than loyal. And at the edge of his sight stood Roger Mortimer, tall, composed, smiling faintly, as though he had sculpted every moment of this day with his own hands. Edward's stomach twisted. Mortimer's gaze lingered on him in a way that made him feel like a pawn carved from wood, a peace to be moved, to be spent. After the ceremony, as nobles crowded around with congratulations, the queen placed a hand on her son's shoulder. Her fingers were cool through his coronation robes. "You carried yourself well," she said softly. Her tone was gentle, but her eyes were distant, focused on the power she had won, not the child she addressed. "England needs peace, Edward. Obedience from its king is the surest path." "Is that what father gave?" Edward asked. For the first time, her expression faltered. Mortimer appeared before she could answer. "Your Majesty," he said with a graceful bow that seemed mockingly deep, "your presence is requested in the royal chambers." Edward responded with a stiff nod. "I will attend shortly." Mortimer's smile tightened. He inclined his head and retreated, his cloak sweeping like a shadow across the marble floor. When he was gone, Edward spoke in a voice barely above breath. "I know what happened at Berkeley." Her mother's lips parted, perhaps in warning, perhaps in fear, but Edward did not wait to hear her reply. He walked away, the new crown cold on his brow. Weeks passed, and the illusion of a peaceful regency grew thinner by the day. Edward was king only in ceremony. Every decree bore Mortimer's influence. Every meeting was observed. Every whisper in the corridors died when the young king approached. Montague visited him under the guise of nightly lessons, but their conversations were always guarded. "They underestimate you," Montague told him during one such meeting, sword resting across his knees. "Let them. A king who waits watches better than one who charges blindly." Edward looked out the window to the training fields below, where older knights sparred in the winter light. "Waiting feels like surrender." "It is preparation," Montague said. "Some day you will act, and when you do, England will remember it." Edward wanted to believe him, but each night he returned to his chambers and stared at the shadows, imagining Mortimer's hands tightening around the crown like a vice. He remembered the screams at Berkeley, the bundle carried down the steps, the silence that followed. A king should protect his realm, but Edward could barely protect himself. Not yet. On a frigid dawn in late January, Edward rose early and walked alone through the palace gardens. Frost glittered on every branch. Breath clouded before him. The world was quiet, honest for once. He stood beneath an old yew tree and rested his hand against the rough bark. "I will not be your puppet," he whispered to the cold air. Behind him, Montague stepped from the shadows, cloak dusted with frost. "When you are ready, I will be at your side." Edward nodded, feeling the spark of defiance that had first ignited at Berkeley. He was 13, crowned by force, surrounded by traitors. But he was also a king. And someday, the men who had taken his father's life would learn what it meant to create an enemy wearing a crown. The throne room of Westminster glowed with morning light, but Edward III felt none of its warmth. Sunbeams spilled through the high arched windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. They made the grand chamber appear dreamlike, almost peaceful. Yet beneath that golden veil, the court seethed with quiet danger. Edward sat upon the throne, spine straight, chin lifted, exactly as the royal tutors instructed. But he knew he did not command the room. The nobles did not bow to him. They bowed to the presence standing just behind his shoulder. Roger Mortimer. Tall, immaculately dressed, hands clasped lightly behind his back, Mortimer radiated the smug confidence of a man who had reshaped the kingdom and found it to his liking. His shadows stretched long across the marble floor, crossing the steps of the throne like a chain. Edward felt its weight with every breath. "Proceed," Mortimer said. Though the word was spoken softly, the royal steward flinched before reading the next petition. It was a land dispute, minor, unremarkable.
Edward listened, asked a question or two, and attempted to rule impartially, but Mortimer interjected before he could finish. The Crown sides with Lord Ferrers. His loyalty in recent months has been exemplary. Edward's jaw tightened. Ferrers was a spineless lord whose support had been purchased with promises whispered in back corridors. Edward recognized the maneuver for what it was, another thread woven into Mortimer's web. When the court session ended, nobles dispersed like birds startled by an unseen predator. Mortimer lingered. Edward could feel him watching. "You hesitated," Mortimer said calmly when they were alone. Edward turned slowly. "I was considering the facts." "Facts," Mortimer murmured, stepping closer, "are what the Crown declares them to be. You would do well to remember that." Edward's pulse quickened, though he worked to keep his voice level. "I thought I was the Crown." Mortimer smiled, an expression like a blade sheathed in velvet. "In time, Your Majesty, but until then, guidance is necessary." "Guidance," Edward repeated, the word bitter on his tongue. "Is that what you call ruling in my name?" Mortimer's eyes hardened, and for a moment the courtly mask slipped. "Your father's failures weakened England. We cannot afford another boy king stumbling into ruin. I serve the realm by serving you, until you are ready." Edward had heard the same gentle poison before, but this time he saw through it. "You serve yourself," he thought. Yet he held his tongue. Survival, for now, required it. Queen Isabella's chambers lay in the eastern wing, overlooking the gardens. The corridors leading there were lined with tapestries of French silk, spoils from her marriage contract long ago. Edward entered quietly, finding his mother seated near the window, embroidering with practiced grace. She looked up and offered a soft smile. "You're troubled." "I am your king." Her needle paused mid-stitch. A breeze rattled the window panes. For several heartbeats, neither spoke. "You must understand," Isabella said finally. "England was collapsing. Your father's decisions forced my hand. Someone had to hold the throne steady. Mortimer has done that." "Mortimer murdered him." Her composure trembled, barely, but enough for Edward to notice. She set the embroidery aside. "You must never speak that out loud again." "I won't need to," Edward said. "Everyone already knows." Isabella crossed the room and took his hands in hers. Her palms were warm, her eyes bright with emotion he could not fully name. He withdrew his hands. "I understand now. Mortimer rules, you defend him, and I wear a crown that means nothing." His mother's voice cracked. "Edward!" A knock interrupted her. A servant bowed, breathless. "My queen, Lord Mortimer wishes to speak with His Majesty." Edward did not look back as he left the room. That evening, Sir William Montague found him in the training yard. The winter dusk cast long shadows across the worn practice field. Edward swung a wooden sword with more anger than accuracy. Montague watched quietly before approaching. "You're striking at ghosts." "Mortimer is no ghost." "Then you must strike with precision," Montague said, taking the weapon from him. "A sword is not for rage, it is for resolute." Edward wiped sweat from his brow. "Resolute won't free me." "No," Montague agreed, "but patience might." Edward sank onto a bench, breath steaming in the cold air. "I feel like a prisoner in my own palace." "You are," Montague said plainly, "but not forever. Mortimer has enemies, powerful ones. Some already whisper that you should take full command." Edward looked up sharply. "Who?" Montague shook his head. "Names must wait. You must grow stronger before they reveal themselves. They won't rally behind a boy, they will rally behind a king." Edward's chest tightened. "And if I fail to become one?" Montague knelt so they were eye to eye. "Then England will fall under Mortimer's tyranny, and your father's death will have been the first stone in that ruin, but you will not fail." "How can you know?" "Because I have seen the way you carry the weight they placed on you, because you listen, learn, and remember, and because you are not your father." Edward swallowed hard. It was not an insult. Montague spoke it as truth, perhaps even hope. "I'm not ready," admitted Edward. "No king ever is. But readiness comes faster when sharpened by injustice." Thunder rumbled somewhere beyond the palace walls. Edward closed his eyes and breathed deeply. The crisp air steadied him. "Teach me," he said. Montague nodded. "With my life." In the weeks that followed, Edward trained in secrecy. Sword work at dawn, strategy past midnight. He studied maps of England and France, learned the names of barons Mortimer had alienated, memorized the weaknesses of every fortress from York to Dover. Outwardly, he obeyed. He signed decrees Mortimer placed before him, attended councils he was not allowed to command, smiled politely at nobles who pitied him. But beneath that veneer, something shifted. Mortimer sensed it. One evening, as Edward returned to his chambers, Mortimer stepped from the shadows of the corridor. "You are restless." Edward kept walking. "A king has much to think about." Mortimer blocked his path. "See that your thoughts do not wander into dangerous places." "Are you threatening me?" "Advising you." Edward stared into the man's cold, calculating eyes. "I will rule in truth one day." Mortimer's lips curved faintly. "We shall see, Your Majesty." That night, Edward knelt beside his bed, staring at the flickering candle. Outside, rain hammered the palace roof like a drum of war. He whispered the words he dared not speak out loud. "I will break your chains, Mortimer." And for the first time, he believed it.
The torches flickered violently in the tunnels beneath Nottingham Castle, their flames hissing each time a draught slid through the unseen cracks in the stone. King Edward III moved carefully through the narrow passage, his heartbeat loud in his ears, his breath misting in the cold underground air. He was 17 now, no longer the frightened boy who had knelt beside a cold coronation crown. Tonight was the night he would stop being a puppet. Tonight, Mortimer would fall. Behind him, Sir William Montague paced quietly, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. The small group of loyal knights who followed moved with deadly efficiency, boots soft on the ancient stone. These tunnels, known only to a handful of royal loyalists, ran beneath the castle like veins. They would carry Edward straight into the heart of his enemy's stronghold. Montague whispered, "Your Majesty, remember, no hesitation. Mortimer is more dangerous cornered than free." Edward nodded, jaw clenched. His entire life had been leading toward this dark, twisting corridor. "I will not hesitate." A shout echoed somewhere above, a guard changing shift perhaps. The sound reverberated through the passage like a warning. Edward swallowed hard. For years, Mortimer had ruled England behind a false curtain of royal grace, his influence tightening around the realm like a noose. The barons despised him. The people whispered stories of his greed. And Edward had waited. Every humiliation, every stolen decree, every reminder that he wore a crown without power, he had stored them, sharp as blades, ready for this night. They reached a ladder rising to a small trapdoor. A sliver of lamplight shone around its edges. Above that door was Mortimer's private chamber. Montague placed a steadying hand on Edward's shoulder. "Your Majesty, remember, no hesitation. Mortimer is more dangerous cornered than free." Edward nodded, jaw clenched. His entire life had been leading toward this dark, twisting corridor. "I will not hesitate." A shout echoed somewhere above, a guard changing shift, perhaps. The sound reverberated through the passage like a warning. Edward swallowed hard. For years, Mortimer had ruled England behind a false curtain of royal grace, his influence tightening around the realm like a noose. The barons despised him. The people whispered stories of his greed. And Edward had waited. Every humiliation, every stolen decree, every reminder that he wore a crown without power, he had stored them, sharp as blades, ready for this night. They reached a ladder rising to a small trapdoor. A sliver of lamplight shone around its edges. Above that door was Mortimer's private chamber. Montague placed a steadying hand on Edward's shoulder. "Your Majesty, from this moment on the realm will change." Edward breathed. "Then let it change by my hand." Montague nodded and climbed the ladder. He pressed his ear to the wood, listening. A muffled voice drifted down, Mortimer speaking calmly. Another voice responded sharply, "Isabella." Edward felt a sudden jolt of pain, a memory of her warm hands guiding his first steps, her voice soothing his childhood nightmares. But that softness was gone, smothered beneath Mortimer's shadow. "Open it," Edward whispered. Montague pushed. The trapdoor rose silently into a dim chamber lined with tapestries and rich furnishings. Mortimer stood near the table with Isabella, their faces illuminated by golden lamplight. Papers were spread before them, troop movements, taxation proposals, royal proclamations bearing Edward's forged signature. Mortimer's back was to the trapdoor. He never saw the first knight emerge, but Isabella did. Her eyes widened, her lips parted in a warning. "Roger!" Too late. Montague vaulted from the trapdoor, steel flashing. Mortimer spun around, shock distorting his features. He reached for his dagger, but Edward was already climbing into the room, boots landing with a thud that silenced everything. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Mortimer's eyes narrowed. "You!" Edward stepped forward. "Your reign ends tonight." Mortimer laughed, a cold, biting sound. "Boy, you think this chamber lacks loyal guards? At a word, I could—" A door burst open. A guard rushed in and immediately fell to the stone, Montague's blade in his throat. More guards stormed in, but Edward's knights met them with brutal precision. Steel clashed. The room exploded into violence. Isabella backed against the wall, shock contorting her features. Mortimer snarled and lunged at Edward. Edward drew his sword. The clash of metal rang through the chamber. Mortimer fought like a man accustomed to winning, striking with force and fury. Edward blocked, steel vibrating in his grip. Mortimer pressed the attack, pushing the young king backward, sneering, "Still a child behind the crown. I should have ended you when your father fell." Rage ignited in Edward's chest, hotter than any fear. He parried, stepped forward, and drove Mortimer back with a sudden fierce strike that sent sparks flying. "I am not my father." Mortimer's grin vanished. As the battle raged, Isabella cried out, "Edward, stop! He is the only one who can—" "Be silent!" Edward barked. His mother froze. Mortimer lunged again, but age had slowed him. Edward caught his blade, twisted, and sent Mortimer staggering. Montague slammed an enemy guard against the wall and shouted, "Your Majesty, finish it!" Edward swept forward, catching Mortimer across the arm. Blood streaked the floor. Mortimer roared in pain and dropped his dagger. He stumbled backward, tripping over a fallen guard. With a crash, he hit the floor. Edward stood over him, sword raised, breathing hard, heart pounding, the weight of the moment crushing him. Mortimer looked up at him, eyes filled with poisonous hatred. You think England will bow to a boy who cannot even kill his enemies? Edward's grip tightened. Watch me. He brought the blade down, not to kill, but to pin Mortimer's cloak to the floor, the steel cutting into the stone beside his head. Mortimer gasped, stunned. Edward leaned close. You will face justice, not murder. I will not become you. Mortimer snarled, but his words were lost as knights hauled him to his feet and shackled his wrists. The battle was done. Isabella broke from the wall and rushed forward, grabbing Edward's arm. You cannot do this. Without him, the throne will collapse. Edward, please. Edward met his gaze. For the first time, she looked small, frightened, human. I am the throne, and you have lost your way. Pain flickered across her face, but Edward did not falter. Montague laid a hand on his shoulder. Your Majesty, the council waits. England waits. Edward nodded. He turned to the guards. Take Roger Mortimer to the Tower. He will answer for his crimes. Mortimer spat blood and hatred. You are making a mistake that will haunt you, boy. Edward stepped closer, voice cold as steel. I am no longer a boy. Mortimer glared until he was torn from the room, dragged towards the fate he had earned. When the echoes faded, Edward looked around the chamber, the fallen guards, the flickering torches, and the first blood that he had drawn for his crown. Montague bowed deeply. Tonight, England has a king. For the first time, Edward felt the truth settle over him, not like chains, but like armor. The boy was gone. The king had risen.
The bells of London tolled with a weight the city had not heard in years. Their echo rolled through the fog-laced streets like a herald of judgment. Roger Mortimer was dead, executed as a traitor on the very gallows he once reserved for others. The people whispered that justice had returned to England. In truth, something far more dangerous had arrived. A king. Edward III stood above the courtyard of the Tower, watching the execution platform being dismantled plank by plank. The morning was raw, wind slicing across the Thames and tugging at his cloak. He did not look away. Mortimer's shadow, long, oppressive, poisonous, was finally gone. Montague stepped beside him. The realm is yours now, undivided. Edward exhaled slowly. It feels heavier than I imagined. It should, Montague replied. Only fools take the crown lightly. Edward managed a faint smile. Montague was right. The crown no longer pressed down as a shackle, but as a burden of purpose, a mantle he had claimed through blood and fire. He left the Tower and returned to Westminster, where the council awaited him. The great hall hummed with tension as nobles argued in sharp whispers. Some doubted him, some feared him, many hoped to win favor with the newly freed king. The moment Edward entered, the hall fell silent. Every man present lowered his head. This time, the gesture felt real. Edward walked to the throne, not rushed, not hesitant. His steps were steady, each one a quiet declaration that the boy who once trembled beneath Mortimer's shadow no longer existed. When he sat, his voice carried through the vaulted chamber. We rebuild. Lord Salisbury bowed. Then we await your command, your Majesty. Edward surveyed the men before him, veterans of his father's troubled reign, ambitious young lords, cautious old barons. A realm fractured, waiting for direction. Our borders lie weak, Edward said. Scotland tests us. France insults us. The treasury strains. Order must be restored. Murmurs rippled through the hall. Edward continued. My first decree, the realm's defenses will be strengthened.
Troops will be mustered, castles reinforced. We will not be prey to foreign opportunists." Lord Wake, older and pragmatic, stepped forward. "And the Queen Mother, sire, her fate?" A hush followed. Isabella had been confined to her apartment since Mortimer's arrest, guarded but unharmed. The court waited, eagerly, hungrily, for Edward's answer. "She will remain under house restraint," Edward said. "She is my mother. Her actions were misguided, but I will not see her treated as an enemy of the crown." Some frowned, others nodded approvingly. Edward saw judgment in their eyes, but he did not waver. He could not sever blood ties, no matter the wounds they carried. Next he addressed the treasury. Corruption rooted out, spending redirected, merchants reassured. As he spoke, he felt the council leaning forward, not to correct him, not to guide him, but to listen. When the session ended, several lords lingered, their expressions thoughtful. Montague approached, pride in his voice. "You commanded them." "I only spoke what needed to be said," Edward replied. "And they heard it. That is the mark of a king." That evening Edward visited the royal stables. Storm clouds gathered overhead, threatening rain, but he needed the fresh air, the scent of horses, the grounding familiarity of leather and hay. He found one stall lit by a lantern, a towering destrier, black as night, nostrils flaring with quiet power. The stable-master bowed. "Your Majesty, the beast is new from the northern stock, unbroken." Edward stepped into the stall. The horse snorted, stamping once, testing him. "We understand each other, you and I both, untamed until the moment demanded otherwise." The horse stilled beneath his touch. Montague appeared in the doorway. "Sire, riders from the north have arrived. Scottish raiders crossed the border near Berwick." Edward's jaw tightened, not in fear, but anticipation. "Have the council convene at dawn. We will answer." Montague nodded. "England will ride behind you." Edward looked into the destrier's dark eyes. "Then let them see I ride first." At dawn the war council assembled. Maps lay strewn across the long table. Reports of burned villages, stolen cattle, and slain guards piled high. The scars of Robert the Bruce's victories still lingered across the northern frontier. Lord Beaumont struck the table with his fist. They believed the crown weakened. Mortimer's chaos emboldened them. Edward stepped forward, placing his hand on the map. "Then we will show them the crown stands unbroken." He traced a line along the border fortresses. "We move troops from the Midlands, reinforce York, rally the lords loyal to my father's memory. They will not sit idle when Scotland threatens again." A general asked cautiously, "Will your Majesty lead the campaign?" He met his gaze without blinking. "Yes." A murmur swept the room. Young kings rarely risked direct battle. Edward welcomed it. He continued issuing orders, clear, decisive, strategic. Montague watched him, and Edward saw approval in his eyes. When the council dispersed, Montague pulled him aside. "You commanded them." "I only spoke what needed to be said," Edward replied. "And they heard it. That is the mark of a king." Before leaving for the campaign, Edward visited his mother. Isabella's chambers were quiet, lit by soft afternoon sunlight. She stood near the window, gazing toward the river. Age had not touched her beauty, but sorrow had carved lines deeper than time. "You come as king," she said without turning. "I come as your son." A faint smile ghosted her lips. "Both are dangerous." Edward stepped closer. For years he had sought warmth from her. Now he found distance, an ocean he could not cross. "I ride north soon. Scotland must be answered." Isabella finally faced him. "Do not make war because Mortimer would have shied away from it. Make war only if it is just." Edward's voice hardened. Justice requires strength. She studied him for a long moment. You look like your father did before everything unraveled. I will not become him. No, she said quietly. You are already walking a different path. There was a pause, one that felt like a wound trying to close. Farewell, mother, Edward said. God keep you, Edward. Return not just victorious, but whole. He bowed his head briefly, then turned and left her behind. When Edward rode from Westminster with his knights, the city gathered in the streets, lifting banners, shouting blessings. Rain threatened, but did not fall. The destrier beneath him moved with thunderous steps, eager for the road ahead. Montague rode at his side. The realm watches, they see a king. Edward looked out at the cheering crowds, the bright standards snapping in the wind, the hope in the people's eyes. No, he said quietly, today they see the lion waking. And with that, Edward III led his army north, toward Scotland, toward destiny, toward the future he would forge with steel and will.
The wind off the northern moors carried a biting cold unlike anything Edward had known in Windsor or Westminster. It slid beneath armor plates, clawed at exposed skin, and whistled like ghosts across the heathered hills. To the English soldiers trudging through the mire of the Cheviots, it was not merely weather, it was a warning. Scotland did not welcome invaders, and it never had. Edward rode at the front of the column, his mantle snapping behind him like a battle banner, though no battle had yet been fought. At barely 20, he possessed the look of a king carved by ambition rather than years, jaw set, gaze fixed on the advancing fog, shoulders squared as if he could hold back the entire north with posture alone. But inside, turmoil churned. The death of Robert the Bruce had changed nothing. Scotland, restless and fierce, refused to yield. His young son, David II, had been crowned amid cheers from a nation that believed itself unconquerable. Meanwhile, Edward's ally, Edward Balliol, thin, cold-eyed, desperate for restoration, pressed the English king to act swiftly. "Support me," Balliol had urged, "and Scotland shall kneel again to your crown." But Edward intended no half measures. He would not merely prop up a claimant, he would claim Scotland's fealty through fire and steel. A horse snorted beside him. Henry of Lancaster drew closer, his face carved in lines of hard-earned wisdom. "Your Grace," he said, "the advance scouts report movement ahead, light-footed riders. They vanish into the mist before we can engage." "I know," Edward nodded. "Border reivers. They harry us, but they want us to follow deeper into their ground." "Then we should not," Lancaster warned. "Their hills swallow armies. Their silence hides more blades than we can count. When a wolf howls at your gate, you do not hide behind it. You cross the threshold and choke it where it stands." Lancaster exhaled through his nose, resigned. "Then let us pray the wolf stands still long enough." They pressed on. Mist thickened, rolling over the land like a living creature. The sun was little more than a dim smear behind gray clouds. Every sound, the clink of bridles, the rustle of banners, the distant call of wild geese, seemed muted, as if Scotland itself were holding its breath. Edward's grip tightened around the pommel of his saddle. A sudden horn blast cracked the silence. Not English. The column jerked to a halt. Men pivoted, hands flying to hilts, shields lifting instinctively. Edward scanned the fog. A shape emerged. No, several shapes, moving low, swift, coordinated. "Shields!" Lancaster barked. "Archers forward!" But the Scots struck first. A line of mounted raiders burst from the mist with a ferocity that sent the front of the English line reeling. Their horses were smaller than the great English destriers, but nimble, weaving between spear points, darting in and out like shadows made flesh. Blades flashed, throats were cut. A banner fell.
Edward drew his sword in one fluid motion, spurring his warhorse forward. Steel clashed as he parried a raider's blow, the impact shivering through his bones. The Scotsman twisted away before Edward could counter, melting back into the fog. "They're trying to scatter us," Lancaster shouted. Not if Edward could help it. He pushed deeper into the melee, refusing to let the chaos swallow his command. "Form your ranks," he bellowed. "Hold the line. Archers, loose when you have a target." Arrows hissed into the mist. Some struck true. Cries of pain confirmed as much, but many vanished without effect. Still, the Scottish raiders were forced to peel back, their hit-and-run assault losing cohesion. Then, as swiftly as they had appeared, they withdrew, disappearing into the fog as if the earth had taken them. A tense stillness followed. Horses stomped nervously. Men wiped blood, some their own, some not, from their armor. The fog drifted slowly, mocking them. Edward surveyed the losses. A few dozen dead, more wounded, none decisive. But the message was unmistakable. Scotland was watching. Lancaster guided his horse beside the king. "Your Grace," he said, "this is their way, Edward. They chip at us, bleed us slowly. If we march deeper, it will grow worse." Edward did not respond immediately. His heart still hammered from the clash, but not with fear, with clarity. This was a different war than he had imagined in childhood tales. No grand formations, no decisive charges, only shadows and the men who worshipped them. "We advance," he finally said, "but not blindly." He ordered scouts to fan out, doubled the pace of reconnaissance, and commanded the construction of a fortified camp before nightfall. Fires crackled as dusk fell, spreading a pale glow across the denuded hillside. Men murmured of the ambush, some loud, some under their breath. Edward sat alone on a rise overlooking the camp, his cloak wrapped tight against the cold. The fog had finally begun to lift, revealing the jagged silhouette of the highlands in the distance. They looked like sleeping beasts, ancient and patient, waiting for the right moment to stir. A soft crunch of footsteps approached. Edward did not turn. He knew the stride. Queen Philippa settled beside him, her presence quiet but steady. "You think too loudly," she said gently. "Is that so?" he breathed, a humorless laugh. "It comes all the way from the other end of the camp," she teased lightly. Then her expression softened. "You fear this land." He considered denying it, but Philippa saw truths before he spoke them. "I fear failure," he admitted. "Then you fear nothing new." Edward let his gaze drift across the moor, as if trying to understand its secrets through force of will. "Scotland fights like no enemy I have faced. They do not meet us openly. They chip at us, bleed us slowly. If we misstep, it could damage our rule beyond repair. Or," she said, "it could forge your rule into something unbreakable." He turned to her. She met his eyes with unwavering calm. "A king is not shaped by the battles he wins easily, Edward. He is shaped by those that refuse to be simple." The wind rose, carrying embers from the campfires skyward like sparks reaching for constellations. Edward watched them fade into the dark, one by one. "Then I must be worthy of this kingdom," he murmured. "And you are," she replied. "But you must be wary. This land hunts the careless." A call echoed across the camp. Scout returning, urgent. Edward straightened, the king rising within the man. Lancaster approached at a brisk stride. "Your Grace, word from the north. Betrayal has moved ahead to reclaim his throne, but he is overnumbered. The Scots gather at Duplin Moor." The implication struck like lightning. A battle imminent, an ally in danger, a moment of decision. Edward felt the cold fall away, replaced by the heat of purpose. "We march at dawn," he said, Scotland thinks itself shadow, let us show it the sun. And as the fires burned low and the winds hissed against the canvas of his tent, Edward III of England closed his eyes and envisioned the coming dawn, one that would demand blood and perhaps deliver destiny.
Rain hammered the stone battlements of Westminster like an army beseeching entrance. The storm had rolled in from the Channel overnight, battering the city with wind that rattled shutters and snuffed out torches along the palace wall. It was as if the heavens themselves were restless, mirroring the turmoil that now twisted the politics of Christendom. Edward stood alone in the painted chamber, the glow of dozens of candles dancing across murals of long-dead kings. His shadow stretched across the mosaic floor, tall and jagged, like the silhouette of a monarch torn between duty and ambition. Before him lay a single parchment, sealed in crimson wax, still unbroken. The will of Charles IV of France. A king dead without a son, a kingdom grazing the brink of uncertainty, a question that would soon set empires aflame. Edward had read the copied contents twice already, though the words burned more deeply with each pass. His mother, Isabella of France, had been sister to 3 French kings, Louis X, Philip V, and Charles IV. All had died without male heirs. By direct blood, Edward was the closest living male relative. In any other land, he muttered to the empty chamber, the matter would be simple. But France was not any other land, and the French nobles had reached for an alternative interpretation, one that suited their power and preserved their own influence. The throne had been given instead to Philip of Valois, a cousin claiming legitimacy through a reinterpreted law that no woman could inherit the crown and no claim could pass through her, a law invented conveniently to exclude Edward. The door creaked open. Parliament's messengers entered quietly, bowing. "Your Grace," one said, "the council waits." Edward nodded and strode toward the great hall. The moment he entered, silence settled. Lords, barons, bishops, dozens of England's most powerful men watched him with expressions ranging from curiosity to apprehension. The air held weight, as if the stones themselves were listening. Lancaster stood at the center, gauntleted hands resting atop the pommel of his sword. Archbishop Stratford lifted his chin slightly, waiting. Philippa sat near the dais, her presence steady as always, though her eyes flickered with guarded concern. Edward took his place before them, letting the quiet stretch. Authority thrived in deliberate composure. "My lords," he began, "France has erred." A ripple passed through the hall. "Their king has died without a son. Their bloodline reaches through my mother to me, yet they deny this lineage. They choose instead a cousin, Philip of Valois, whose claim is weaker, but whose presence is more agreeable to their circle of nobles." Lancaster cleared his throat. "France argues the Salic law." "Salic law," Edward said sharply, "is a Frankish remnant, never applied to the French succession until now. They wield it only to keep the crown from falling to England." A murmur of agreement rose from several barons. Archbishop Stratford spoke next, tone measured. "To press this claim would invite consequences that may last generations." "Consequences are already upon us," Edward replied. "Philip of Valois has seized Gascony, arrested my English merchants, and claimed overlordship over lands held by my ancestors for centuries. If we do nothing, we concede, not only France, but English honor." The chamber simmered with unease. Edward stepped forward, letting fire seep into his voice. "I do not seek war lightly, but neither will I bow to arrogance disguised as law." Lancaster's brow tightened. "Would you truly claim the throne of France, Edward?
Not merely defend your lands, but take the crown itself." For the first time, the hall held its breath. Edward did not hesitate. Yes. Gasps echoed like breaking glass. Philippa's expression did not change. She expected this, but a subtle fear shadowed her eyes. She knew what she was stepping into. France was larger, richer, with an army famed for cavalry and chivalric might. A war between England and France would not be a campaign. It would be an era. Lancaster recovered first. "Then understand this, Your Grace. Such a claim requires unity at home. Scotland still harasses our northern border. Wales remains restless. If you stretch our forces too thin—" Edward lifted a hand. "I intend to finish Scotland swiftly. Only then can we face France with full strength." "And funds," Stratford pressed. "A war across the Channel, fought against a kingdom of that wealth, will demand more gold than your treasury holds." Edward's jaw clenched. He knew that. His father's debts had not evaporated with a coronation. "I will raise funds," he said, "through Parliament, through alliances, through trade, through every means necessary." A baron spoke from the back. "Your Grace, France is mighty. Their knights are numerous, their lands vast. To provoke them—" Edward turned sharply. "They have provoked me. They seize what is mine, imprison my people, and belittle our crown. If we allow it today, they will take more tomorrow." The baron fell silent. Philippa rose from her seat. The hall shifted. She rarely intervened in council sessions. "My husband speaks of honor, but honor alone does not win wars. We must consider strategy. England cannot stand alone in this." Edward looked at her, grateful for the political acumen behind her gentle manner. "You suggest allies. Flanders depends on English wool. The Low Countries despise French interference. The Holy Roman Emperor seeks balance in Europe. If we weave these threads carefully, we may bind France from multiple fronts." Lancaster nodded slowly. "A war fought with partners is more winnable than one fought in solitude." Stratford exhaled. "And if France refuses diplomacy, if Valois sees alliances as aggression—" Edward's voice dropped to a low, cold certainty. "Then we shall meet him on the field, and history will remember which of us claimed the right by blood and which took it by fear." A heavy pause followed. Finally, Lancaster knelt, not as a subject, but as a commander acknowledging a king ready to reshape the world. He spoke quietly, but the hall carried the words like thunder. "I will claim what is mine by birth and by right. I will be king of England and of France." Outside, lightning cracked across the storm-thick sky. Inside, a war centuries in the making had just begun.
The tide rolled in like a dark army beneath the moon, heaving against the wooden piles of the harbor at Portsmouth. Lanterns swung from rigging lines as the wind picked up, casting wavering gold across the decks of England's growing fleet. The masts, hundreds of them, stood like a forest of spears piercing the night sky. Edward III stood upon the pier, with his cloak snapping behind him, breathing in the scent of brine and pitch. The sea always stirred something restless in him, a reminder of both promise and peril. Tonight, it felt like a doorway into destiny. "We can field 200 ships by summer," the master of the king's ships reported, bowing slightly. "Cogs, barges, galleys, enough to move supplies, horses, and men across the channel. But your grace knows as well as I the dangers." Edward's eyes stayed on the water. "The French?" "Aye, sire. Their fleet grows stronger each month. They raid our coasts with impunity. They build in the shipyards at Rouen and Harfleur day and night. If they complete their preparations before we strengthen ours, they will control the Channel," Edward finished.
And a king without control of the sea was a king whose ambitions were chained. Lancaster approached behind him, cloak fur-lined and heavy against the cold. "Your Grace," he said quietly, "the Admiralty sends word that French vessels were sighted near Jersey." Edward turned sharply. "Already?" "Small ships, scouts likely, but their presence sends a clear message." Edward stared out across the channel, its surface glinting like a blade beneath the moon. Valois was not waiting. He was probing, testing, preparing to strangle England's trade and drown its ambitions before a single English soldier could land on French soil. Behind them, the rhythmic chant of sailors loading supplies filled the night. Crates slammed, ropes tightened, orders echoed up and down the docks. Every heartbeat of the harbor belonged to a nation preparing for war. Edward walked along the pier, the master shipwrights trailing behind him. Philippa had remained in Westminster, managing the affairs of court and securing the loyalties needed for Parliament's financial approval. She trusted him to manage the sword, as he trusted her to manage the crown. He paused before one of the largest cogs, a towering vessel, newly built, its hull reinforced and freshly tarred. "What's her name?" he asked. "The Sovereign, sire," one of the shipwrights said with pride. "Fast for her size, carries 80 men and their arms. She could outpace a French galley with the right wind." Edward laid a gloved hand upon the smooth timber. "She will carry knights across the sea who have never known defeat," he murmured. "Let her name remind them of what we intend to become." As he moved down the line of ships, each with its own character and promise, a messenger raced up the pier, breathless. "Your Grace, Lord Morley requests immediate counsel. The French have issued a proclamation." "Speak," Edward demanded. The messenger swallowed. "Philip of Valois declares that any English ship found in the Channel is to be seized, its cargo confiscated, its crew imprisoned as enemies of France." Edward's jaw tensed. He felt the slow burn of anger beneath his ribs. "He treats my merchants as criminals. He starves my ports, now he threatens to choke my kingdom." Lancaster's voice lowered. "If you wish for this war, Edward, understand France will not hold back." Edward turned to him, eyes shining with fierce resolve. "Nor will I." A cold wind whipped across the water. The messenger bowed and retreated as the king and his commanders strode toward the harbor watchtower. The climb was steep, the steps slick with sea spray, but Edward took them two at a time. From the top, the entire fleet lay below them, lanterns glowing like clustered stars on the dark water. "This is the army that must carry us across the sea," Edward said. "But ships alone will not win us France." "No," Lancaster agreed, "but a fleet can win us the chance to fight." Edward folded his arms, the wind tugging at his mantle. "Valois believes he can starve us into submission. He forgets England has starved before and endured." Lancaster stepped closer. "If he controls the Channel, he can invade." Edward looked at him sharply. "That is why we cannot simply match France. We must surpass her, outbuild her, outmaneuver her, strike before she can swallow us whole." A bell rang below, deep, solemn. Edward turned to see a group of knights approaching on horseback, cloaks heavy with rain. At their head rode Robert Morley, Admiral of the Western Fleet, a man whose sea-hardened face was etched with lines carved by storm and battle. He dismounted with a bow. "Your Grace, the time has come to choose our strategy." Edward nodded. "Speak." "We cannot wait for the French to block our ports. We must take the fight to them, disrupt their shipyards, raid their coastal towns, cripple their preparations." Lancaster frowned. "Provoking a naval campaign before our fleet is complete is dangerous." Morley countered. "Doing nothing is fatal." Edward watched the waves crash against the pier, each surge a reminder of time slipping away. "What do you propose?" he asked. Morley drew a small chart from his belt. "We strike at Kasdand, a Flemish island loyal to France, a nest of raiders, a warning to Philippe de Valois that England does not cower. Edward studied the map. The assault would be bold, risky, a declaration of war in action, if not in words. Success there could rally Flanders to us, and if Flanders joins England, France loses its richest trade routes. Lancaster rubbed his chin. And if the French counterstrike while our fleet is abroad? Edward looked up from the map, eyes steady. Then we meet them on the sea. The wind howled as if in response. He rolled up the chart. Prepare the fleet. At dawn, we set course for Kasdan. Morley bowed with a fierce grin. As you command, sire. When the admiral departed, Lancaster lingered. You walk a narrow line, Edward. A king claiming 2 crowns must learn to dance on narrow lines. He turned his gaze across the moonlit waters. The channel shimmered like tempered steel beneath it. Beyond it lay France, vast, proud, and unyielding. But Edward felt something stir within him, something sharper than fear, brighter than ambition, a sense of inevitability. He raised his chin, letting the cold wind strike his face. The sea will test us, he said quietly, but it will also carry us to greatness. Below, the English fleet creaked and groaned like a beast awakening. And as dawn approached, the sword and the sea prepared to become one.
The fields around Tournai lay crushed beneath the weight of war. Trampled wheat, charred farmsteads, broken wagons half sunk in muddy ruts. Smoke drifted in thin gray ribbons above the horizon, where the city's towers speared the sky. Its ancient stone walls, thick and resolute, bore the scars of a dozen failed sieges. Now they braced for yet another. Edward III stood upon a rise overlooking the encircled city. The summer heat pressed heavily upon his armor, but he ignored the discomfort. His gaze swept across the English and Flemish encampments sprawled before the walls like a vast, bristling beast. Thousands of tents, hundreds of siege engines, the hum of an army coiled for the strike. Beside him, Queen Philippa adjusted the reins of her palfrey. Dust coated the hem of her riding cloak, but she bore it with stoic dignity. Her presence, though unusual on a battlefield, was a deliberate message. This campaign was not a raid or a gesture. It was the beginning of a claim that would shake Europe. Strong walls, Philippa murmured, studying the city. Stubborn men. Edward nodded. Tournai has been French for centuries. They will not open their gates simply because a king demands it. Then we give them reason to reconsider. Behind them, Lancaster rode up, helm tucked beneath his arm. Sweat glistened on his brow, though he stood tall despite the weight of steel. Your Grace, the trebuchets are in place. If we begin the bombardment tonight, we may topple the outer battlements before Valois arrives. He will arrive, Edward said softly. Valois cannot allow us such a prize. Lancaster hesitated. And if he brings the full might of France? Edward turned his eyes toward the distant forest, where scouts reported movement, glimpses of banners, glints of armor. Then we meet him on ground of our choosing. A horn blared from the outer ridge. A rider approached at breakneck speed, splattered with mud and panting hard. He dismounted in a half-stumble and knelt. Your Grace, Tournai refuses parley. They say they will starve before yielding. Edward exchanged a look with Philippa. She saw hard resolve in his expression, but also a flicker of something deeper, frustration, perhaps even doubt. A siege demanded resources, time, and patience, all while France gathered strength. Every day spent at Tournai tightened the noose around England's position. Order the bombardment, Edward said at last. The camp erupted into motion. Soon the first stone, larger than a man's torso, was hauled into the cradle of a trebuchet. Torches flared. A drumbeat signaled the readiness of the crews. "Loose!" the lead engineer shouted. The great machine groaned as its arms swung, hurling the stone in a slow, terrible arc. It sailed over the plain, whistling through the air before smashing into Tournai's outer wall with a thundering crack. The siege had begun. For 3 days and nights the bombardment continued. Stones rained upon the city, pulverizing towers, flattening rooftops, and igniting fear among those trapped inside. Yet Tournai held. Its walls, though battered, refused to break. In the English encampment, tension thickened with each passing hour. Edward walked among the soldiers at dusk on the 4th evening, his boots sinking in churned mud. Campfires hissed in the humid air. Men sharpened blades, repaired armor, whispered of French reinforcements. He paused beside a group of archers adjusting their bowstrings. "Your aim today felled many defenders." The men stiffened, surprised by the king's presence. "We serve, sire," one replied. Edward nodded, but his thoughts wandered. They were all serving, but for how long before supplies thin or desertions crept in? Tournai's defenders were not the only ones facing hunger. Lancaster joined him. "Scouts report Valois is less than a week away. His cavalry rides under full banners." Edward's jaw tightened. Let him come. One decisive victory could break France's confidence. "Or ours," Lancaster murmured. Edward ignored the warning. Instead, he looked toward Philippa's pavilion. Light flickered behind its canvas walls, and he saw her silhouette bent over maps, tireless, calculating. "She worries for you," Lancaster said. "She worries for England." A sudden commotion drew their gaze. A Flemish emissary approached under escort, a stout man with a red beard, his expression grim. "Sire, our provisions dwindle. My people suffer for this siege. If Valois arrives and crushes us, Flanders will bleed." Edward responded sharply. "If Valois crushes us, the whole of Europe will kneel to France." But even as he spoke, he felt the tremor of uncertainty beneath his words. The emissary bowed again, but withdrew with heavy steps. "The Allies grow restless," Lancaster exhaled. "Then we must give them hope," Edward replied. "What hope remains? The walls stand, our supplies thin, and Valois approaches." Edward stared at the burning horizon where the sun dipped behind smoke-choked clouds. "We fight," he said, "until the gates open or they bury us at their foot." On the 6th morning, a hush settled across the camp. The air was unnaturally still. Even the horses seemed uneasy. Philippa approached Edward as he adjusted his sword hilt. "Scouts report movement near the hills," she said. "Valois?" Edward asked. She shook her head. "Not an army, a messenger." A lone rider approached beneath a white flag. Edward and his guard rode out to meet him halfway between the English lines and the city walls. The messenger dismounted, bowing deeply. "Your Grace," he said, "I bring word from within Tournai." Edward tensed. "Speak." "Your sister, Countess Jana of Brabant, has entered the city under safe passage. She begs for mediation between you and the citizens of Tournai." Edward felt a flicker of both surprise and irritation. Jean, clever, diplomatic, relentless, had always possessed a talent for appearing precisely where tempers ran hottest. The messenger continued. "She entreats you to consider peace. The city cannot withstand much longer, but neither can your army." Edward closed his eyes briefly. Jean's presence was both a blessing and an accusation. She saw truths others were too loyal or too afraid to voice. He turned to the messenger. "Tell my sister I will grant her audience." Jean arrived at the English tent like a storm in silk, stern,
confident, refusing to bow to circumstance. Edward dismissed the guards, leaving only Philippa and Lancaster present. "You endanger Flanders, you endanger your alliances, and Valois marches with a force larger than either of us can contain." Edward held her gaze. "Tournai is a symbol. If it falls, France trembles. If you fall," Jean countered, "England breaks." Silence pressed in. Philippa stepped forward. "What do you propose?" "A truce," Jean said. "Let the city remain intact. Let both sides withdraw with dignity. Save your strength for the true struggle, France itself." Lancaster watched Edward tensely. "Your pride blinds you," Jean whispered, "but it need not doom you." Edward turned away, fists clenched. The walls of Tournai stood firm, but he felt his own resolve bending under truth's weight. At last, he exhaled, "Send word. We will discuss terms." By dusk, a truce was agreed upon. No victory, no defeat. A pause in a war that had only begun. As Edward looked upon Tournai's battered silhouette, he felt neither triumph nor shame, only a quiet, simmering certainty. This siege had not broken France, but the next blow would, and it would come not against stone walls, but against the heart of a kingdom.
The first rumor arrived on a salt-stained scrap of parchment carried by a Flemish merchant whose hands trembled as though gripped by winter fever. Edward read it by candlelight in his Windsor chamber, the flame guttering in a draught that had not been there a moment before. "A sickness beyond reason," it said, "a darkness in the lungs. They die within days. Cities in the east empty like overturned cups." For the first time since assuming the French crown, in claim if not in fact, Edward felt a chill that no armor, no throne, no victory could shield him from. Wars were fought with men and steel, but this whispered shadow, had no name, no face, and no surrender. He folded the message slowly, as though fearing it might infect him through touch alone. Across Europe, the winds were shifting. In the weeks following the bruising siege of Tournai, alliances frayed like rotted rope. Edward returned to England with his court, his coffers drained, his armies weary, and his ambitions for France intact but bruised. Parliament pressed him for explanations, creditors pressed him for payments, and Queen Philippa urged caution, not in matters of war, but in matters of rumor. "Merchants tell tales to hide their own failings," she said gently, as they rode through the autumn-soaked fields surrounding Windsor. "Bandits roamed the Rhine, that alone empties cities." Edward wanted to agree, God, he wanted to, but the fear in that merchant's eyes, raw, primal, still clung to him like smoke after a battle. Men fear bandits. What he described was fear of the Lord's wrath or something worse. Philippa said nothing. She only tightened her cloak against the dying light. By December, the rumors grew teeth. Ships from the Mediterranean arrived half-crew or ghost crew, the remaining sailors speaking of corpses stacked higher than their masts in Kaffa, of Genoese traders dying mid-oath, of priests who fled their parishes because burying the dead became impossible. A sickness moved westward like a silent army. Edward summoned his physicians, who came armed with Latin treatises and theories of corrupted air, of misaligned stars, of divine displeasure. When the king asked whether England could be spared, they exchanged glances like guilty children. "No land is spared when God chooses to cleanse the world," murmured Brother Athelwyn, his voice thin as parchment. The room fell colder, despite the blazing hearth. Yet the machinery of kingship could not halt for prophecy or plague. Envoys from Flanders, now frantic with fear, begged England for renewed protection, as French forces regrouped. Edward's counsel argued for advantage. France, weakened by disease, would be ripe for the taking. But Edward, who had seen too many needless deaths, felt an unease that soured every opportunistic suggestion. "War is predictable," he said. "This is not. If France collapses," the Earl of Northampton pressed, "you could claim the throne without another siege." "And inherit a wasteland?" Edward snapped. "A crown atop a mountain of corpses?" Northampton bowed stiffly, chastened, but the truth remained. The world was changing, and Edward's enemies might fall without a single English arrow loosed. But at what cost? The first confirmed report reached England in early spring. A trading ship from Gascony drifted into the port of Southampton with torn sails and no lanterns lit. Dockworkers boarded her and found nothing living above deck. Below, the stink struck them like a physical blow, rot mixed with something sharper, unnatural. Most fled instantly. 2, braver or more foolish, ventured deeper and discovered a pile of corpses, their bodies swollen, mottled black at the armpits and groin. By the time the port reeves arrived, the 2 dockworkers were already fevered. They died the next day. Southampton locked its gates, and the rumors became reality. At Windsor, Edward received the news in grim silence. Philippa crossed herself. Their children playing in the inner courtyard moments before were called inside. The king straightened slowly. The weight of every past decision suddenly doubled. "It begins," he murmured. Sir Walter Manny, ever loyal, placed a hand on the table edge as though steadying himself. "What do you command, sire?" "Prepare the ports," Edward said. "No ships enter without inspection. Quarantine anything from the south." "And London?" Manny asked. Edward hesitated. Even thinking it felt like sacrilege. "If London falls," he said quietly, "England falls." But the plague moved as if guided by an unseen general. It traveled not just by ships, but by wind, rat, flea, and fear itself. Before the end of spring, reports came from Bristol, Portsmouth, and the Cinque Ports. Priests wrote of parishioners dying so quickly they could not receive last rites. Graves were dug in fields without consecration. Bells tolled day and night until bell ringers collapsed from exhaustion. Edward rode to London with a small escort, ignoring the protests of half his council. He entered the city through gates muffled in black cloth. The streets were emptier than he had ever seen. The bustle of merchants replaced by the silence of gaping shutters. Smoke from hastily burned refuse lingered in the air. At Cheapside, he saw a woman kneeling beside a covered body. She lifted her head as he passed, eyes hollow, and whispered, "Please, stop it." Not at him, but at God, or fate, or the world unraveling. Edward dismounted and approached her. His men tensed, but he raised a hand. "What is your name?" he asked softly. "Marion," she whispered. "My husband, yesterday he breathed. Today he is gone." Edward knelt beside her, ignoring the gasps of his escort. The weight of her grief hit him with more force than any battlefield loss. "I swear to you," he said, voice raw, "I will not abandon my people, not now, not ever." Her tears overflowed. She bowed her head, and for the first time in years, Edward felt powerless. Back at Windsor, the Queen took command where the King could not. Philippa organized relief for affected towns, summoned foreign physicians, and corresponded with abbeys to provide shelter and food. Her resolution became a light in the darkening kingdom, and people whispered of her courage with awe. But even she could not stop the tide. In June, word came from France. The king's rivals, his enemies, and the innocent alike were dying by the thousands. Some French knights accused the English of poisoning wells. Others begged Edward for truce until the sickness passed. A truce born not of diplomacy, but of fear. And with it, an opportunity Edward had not foreseen. One evening, standing on the ramparts overlooking the twilight-drenched Thames, Edward weighed the fate of kingdoms. His claim to France still glittered in the distance like an unclaimed crown, but now the path to it wound through a landscape of ash and graves. Behind him, Philippa approached silently. "You cannot fight an enemy you cannot see," she said. "I can't fight this," Edward replied, "but I can shape what comes after." He looked toward the unseen horizon, where England's future, France's future, Europe's future trembled like a candle before the wind. "The old world is dying," he murmured, "and when the storm passes, a new one will rise. I must be ready to lead it." Philippa slipped her hand into his. "Then we faced the darkness together," she said. Edward closed his eyes. The Black Death had arrived, and the fate of his kingdom and his claim would never be the same.
The rain began at dawn, thin, needling, and cold enough to bite through mail. Edward watched it fall from the crest of the ridge where his army waited, the hills sloping gently downward to a muddied plain already scarred with the dark tracks of hundreds of boots. Beyond, the French banners flickered like a storm-tossed sea, fleur-de-lis swelling on the horizon, a mass of men-at-arms and crossbowmen gathering with the inevitability of thunder. The king's own banner, a roaring golden lion, hung heavy and wet behind him, its edges snapping in the wind. He had chosen this ground with meticulous care, high ground, dry enough to hold, flanked by woods on either side, the perfect choke point for a larger enemy. And the French were larger, God knew they were larger. But size did not win battles, not today. Edward drew in a slow breath, letting the air settle his heartbeat. "This ridge will decide the fate of kingdoms," he murmured. The men around him, the Prince of Wales, barely 16, Sir Walter Manny, the earls and captains of his host, fell silent. In the distance, French trumpets wailed like wounded beasts. The Battle of Crécy had begun. Edward moved along the lines, his cloak darkened by rain, the mud sucking at his boots. His archers stood in staggered wedges, thousands strong, their longbows wrapped in oilcloth. They bowed their heads slightly as he passed, not as subjects, but as warriors ready to stand their ground. "We have faced death before," Edward told them, raising his voice above the wind. "This field is ours. Hold it, and France will tremble." A ripple of confidence moved through their ranks. The Prince of Wales, Edward's eldest son, already called the Black Prince by men in hushed admiration, rode beside him. His armor gleamed dully beneath the gray sky, and though his young face was set with determination, the king saw the flicker of fear behind his eyes. "Are you ready, Edward?" the king asked quietly. "I am," he answered. "If I fall today, you will not," his father cut in. "You will stand, and England will stand with you." The boy nodded once, jaw tightening. Behind them, the thunder of French cavalry grew louder. Early afternoon. The French vanguard surged forward, crossbowmen from Genoa forced ahead by the shouts and whips of their commanders. Rain drummed against their bowstrings, sapping their tension, their effectiveness. The English archers stood silent, waiting for the king's signal. A Genoese captain shouted orders. Crossbows lifted, bolts snapped through the air. Edward did not flinch. "Loose!" he roared. In a single motion, smooth, practiced, terrifying, the English line drew and released. A black cloud of arrows arced upward, defying the rain, and came down with the hiss of an angry god. The Genoese recoiled, men fell screaming, bows dropped, shields lifted too late. Another volley, then another. Panic rippled through the vanguard. The French cavalry behind them screamed for forward movement, but the fleeing Genoese collided with mounted men-at-arms, sowing chaos. The rain turned the slope into a slick of blood and mud. Edward watched with cold precision. "Steady," he told his captains. "Let them break themselves." The French cavalry charged next, hundreds of mailed horses pounding the earth, their hooves churning mud, lances lowered. The English archers planted sharpened stakes in front of their positions. Horses screamed as they impaled themselves, momentum snapping bones. The air filled with the thrum of arrows and the guttural cries of dying beasts. Yet still they came. A wave of French knights smashed into the English men-at-arms. Steel clashed, mud erupted. The wind carried the roar of battle like a living thing. Edward glanced toward the right flank, where the Prince of Wales fought. The boy was surrounded. A messenger rode hard, sliding to a halt beside the king. "Sire, the prince is pressed by a heavy French charge. His knights request reinforcements." Edward's jaw tightened. Walter Manny turned, already preparing a contingent, but the king held up a hand. "No," he said. Manny blinked. "Sire?" "He must hold," Edward said quietly. "If I send aid now, they will say he won by my strength, not his own. But if he falls—" Edward locked eyes with his old friend. "He will not fall." Manny swallowed his protest. The king turned to the ridge, rain streaking down his face. Let him rise or break, Edward thought, heart clenched like a fist. Let France meet the future of England today. On the right flank, the Prince of Wales fought like a man touched by fire. His sword arm rose and fell with relentless rhythm. His knights formed a circle around him, shields up, blades flashing.
French chargers broke against them like waves against rock. A massive French knight, crest of a golden boar, barreled toward the prince. The boy barely brought his shield up in time. The blow knocked him backward, landing him in the mud. The knight raised his sword for the killing stroke. The Black Prince rolled aside, mud spraying, surged to his feet, and drove his blade up beneath the man's gorget. Steel met flesh. The French giant collapsed. The English around him roared, and far across the field Edward exhaled with trembling relief. By late afternoon, the battlefield was a graveyard. The French attacked in wave after wave, 8 times, 10 times, 12 times. Their commanders bickered, their formations snarled by their own desperation. Bodies lay thick as fallen leaves. Horses thrashed helplessly. Arrows jutted from mail and wood and earth like the quills of some monstrous beast. Edward surveyed the carnage with grim resolve. "This is the turning of an age," he said softly. "The bow against the knight. The new world against the old." As the sun broke briefly through the clouds, its weak light shone across the broken French ranks, an army shattered by pride and misjudgment. Crécy was decided. Evening fell. Torches flickered along the ridge as the English tended their wounded. The Prince of Wales dismounted before his father, his armor dented, his face smeared with blood and mud. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then Edward stepped forward and placed his hand on his boy's shoulder. "You proved yourself today," he said, voice thick. "No king could ask more of a son." The prince bowed his head, overcome. "England will remember Crécy," Edward continued, looking out across the battlefield. "And France will never forget it." The wind carried the distant groans of the dying, the bitter echo of a kingdom humbled. The path to Calais lay open. The French crown, his claim, glimmered once more within reach. But even as triumph surged through him, Edward felt a darker certainty beneath it. The Black Death had not halted for this victory. Its shadow marched behind them still, and no battlefield, however glorious, could change the storm that approached.
The wind off the channel carried a taste of salt and rot as Edward III surveyed the pale-walled city of Calais from his command tent. It had been a year since Crécy, a year of encirclement, starvation, disease, and unbroken iron discipline. Now, at last, the city stood on the brink of collapse, its people gaunt, its supplies exhausted, its defenders too weak to lift shields for more than minutes at a time. Dawn seeped into the camp in muted gray. Smoke curled from English cook fires, and the low murmur of soldiers breaking their fast filled the air. But there was an undercurrent of expectation, a taut wire running through the host. Today or tomorrow, the siege would end. Edward tightened his cloak against the cold. "Calais is breaking," he said quietly. Sir Walter Manny, standing beside him, followed his gaze to the distant battlements where only a handful of French sentries remained. "They can hold no longer. Hunger is the truest conqueror, sire." "Perhaps, but it is not hunger whose name they will curse. It is mine." The siege had tested him in ways Crécy had not. Battles were swift, brutal, decisive. A siege was a slow agony of will, of endurance, of conscience. Edward had ordered the tightening of the blockade until not even a sparrow could fly into the city without English arrows tracking it. The French king, Philippe VI, had tried and failed to break the encirclement. Relief fleets were scattered, tunnels collapsed. Every attempt to slip food into Calais ended in bodies washing up along the shore. Now, inside the walls, corpses lined the streets. Dogs and cats had vanished weeks ago. Some said the people boiled leather and chewed parchment to keep death at bay. Edward could not allow pity to undo victory.
Calais was the ideal bridgehead into France. Stone harbor, fortified walls, deep water port, more valuable than any pitched battle. To win France, he must have Calais. To have Calais, he must crush it without mercy. The midday sun offered little warmth. Edward stood with Manny and several captains when a royal herald galloped from the northern outworks. Mud splashed high as he reined in before the king. "Sire," the herald gasped, "a delegation from Calais approaches the gate under a flag of truce. They request parley." For a moment the camp fell silent. Edward exhaled slowly. At last. He mounted his horse and rode to the front lines. Soldiers parted respectfully. The English siege works, an iron ring of earthen ramparts, timber towers and trenches, loomed behind him. Ahead lay the main gate of Calais, its drawbridge lowered for the first time in months. From the shadows beneath the archway emerged 6 figures, walking unsteadily but with heads held high. Their clothes were threadbare, their limbs thin as withered branches, their faces hollow. But their bearing, proud, unbroken, marked them as men of status. The leader, a gray-haired burgher named Eustache de Saint-Pierre, bowed low before Edward. "My lord," he said, voice hoarse with thirst, "Calais can resist no longer. Our people die by the hundreds. We beg your mercy. Let us surrender the city and spare the innocent." Edward studied the 6 men. Behind them, through the open gate, he glimpsed the devastation. Gaunt faces crowding the streets, mothers clutching skeletal children, the ruins of a once proud town. He felt the tug of compassion. Then he remembered Philippe VI's insults, the murdered merchants, the treacheries of French captains who offered truces only to break them, the price in English lives this siege had cost. He straightened coldly. "Calais will suffer no terms. Your city's defiance must be answered. If it is to live, the price must be paid." De Saint-Pierre closed his eyes, bowed his head. "Name the price." "You 6, he said, "bareheaded, in your shirts, nooses around your necks. You will bring me the keys of the city and place yourselves at my mercy. If I judge your sacrifice sufficient, Calais will be spared." A murmur rippled through the English commanders, some approving, some uncomfortable. De Saint-Pierre nodded slowly, accepting his fate without flinching. "Then we will come," he said, and he turned back toward the starving city. When they returned, the camp had fallen into a hush. Thousands of English soldiers lined the path, watching as the 6 burghers of Calais walked barefoot across the mud. Their shirts clung to their emaciated frames, coarse ropes circled their necks, and they carried the heavy iron keys of the city between them. The sound of their steps, soft, unsteady, carried more weight than any battlefield roar. Edward sat in judgment on a raised platform. Queen Philippa stood beside him, her face pale. The sight of the 6 condemned men struck her like a blow. De Saint-Pierre stepped forward and dropped to one knee, lowering his head so the rope brushed the ground. "Great King," he said, "we bring you the keys to Calais and our lives in exchange for the safety of our people. Take them, and may God grant you wisdom." The crowd held its breath. Edward's expression was carved from stone. "You defied me. You forced my hand, and now you come asking mercy when none was given by your own king. Please, de Saint-Pierre whispered. "Our people suffer enough. Spare them." Edward's jaw tightened. He could feel the eyes of his army on him. Mercy was strength and weakness. Which would this moment require? Philippa stepped forward unexpectedly. "My lord," she said softly, "for the sake of God, who showed mercy to all mankind, I beg you, spare these men. They have given themselves for thousands. Such sacrifice honors you as much as any victory." Edward turned to her. In her eyes he saw exhaustion, compassion, and a queen's understanding of how victory must be remembered. He nodded. Once. "So it be," he said. "Their lives are spared." The exhalation from the crowd was like a gust of wind. The burghers broke down, weeping with relief. Philippa moved to them, touching each gently, offering words of comfort. Edward rose from his seat. "Calais will be repopulated with loyal English families, its walls rebuilt, its harbor strengthened. Today, Calais becomes the English gateway to France." A cheer rose from the camp, swelling beneath the darkening sky. But as Edward looked toward the city, broken, starving, humbled, he felt no triumph, only certainty. This was not the end of the war. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one written in hunger, steel, and an unbroken will. And England, under his hand, was just getting started.
The bells of Calais rang not for victory, but for burial. Their hollow clang rolled across the harbor as Edward III stood upon the newly secured battlements, the wind off the channel tugging at his cloak. The air was laced with smoke from burned refuse, a desperate attempt to keep sickness at bay, and with the brine of the sea. On the quays below, bodies wrapped in linen were carried one by one to the tide, committed to depths that had swallowed countless ships, but never grief. A year ago, this city had defied him. Now it knelt in exhausted surrender. And yet, as Edward watched the pale sails of English supply ships approach, he felt none of the triumph he had imagined at Calais' fall. Victory had a strange taste these days, metallic, uncertain. "Another fever death last night," murmured Sir Walter Manny behind him, "and no vessel from London for 3 days." Edward's grip tightened on the parapet. "Because London is dying." The words tasted bitter. The Black Death had seeped into England's veins, a slow, unstoppable poison. Reports from Windsor and Westminster spoke of streets littered with bodies, carts overloaded with corpses, priests collapsing as they performed last rites. Even the Thames could not hide the stench. No king could command a plague to halt. And Edward, master of armies, master of sieges, felt the smallness of his power. That evening he held council in the stone hall of Calais, a place once reserved for French magistrates. The room was filled with the smoky breath of torches and the uneasy murmurs of commanders trying to keep fear from their faces. Maps lay spread across a long table, France fractured into contested territories, England shaded with creeping ink marks where the plague spread. "We cannot return home," declared the Earl of Warwick, slamming a fist on the table. "To sail into England now is to step willingly into God's judgment." "It is our home," Manny countered. "Our people need us." "But what good are we dead?" Warwick snapped. "Half the shires are infected. We'd be walking into a graveyard." The Prince of Wales, older now by battle and burden, sat silently, studying the maps as though they were the anatomy of a beast he meant to kill. Edward looked from face to face, seeing the same dread etched into each.
Even hardened knights feared an enemy they could not cleave with steel. France suffers the same fate, Edward said at last. Philippe's lands burn with sickness, cities emptied, armies disbanded. Then let the plague do our work for us, Warwick muttered. Edward's gaze sharpened. I do not want a kingdom of corpses. I want a throne. A pause, heavy and fraught. We will hold Calais, he continued, voice steady. Strengthen its walls, clear the harbor. Let it become our bastion while the storm passes. And England, sire? Manny asked quietly. Edward closed his eyes for a heartbeat. England must endure without us. At dawn, a ship limped into the harbor, a battered cog flying the red and gold standard of Westminster. Its arrival brought a current of tension through the camp. Edward descended to the quayside as the gangplank was lowered. A lone messenger disembarked, face pale, hands trembling. He bowed deeply, voice breaking before the words even formed. Sire, the plague spreads through London like fire through dry thatch. Thousands dead, entire streets abandoned. Edward's breath caught. He had known grief was coming, but knowing and hearing were different shores. And the court? He asked. The Queen has sent assurances of her health, but 3 of your household knights are dead. 2 members of Parliament, half the servants at Westminster. Edward shut his eyes. Images flickered. Philippa walking the halls of Windsor, his children laughing in the gardens, the Black Prince, too distant from his mother's arms. Sire, the messenger whispered, even the physicians say they cannot keep pace. The dead outnumber the living. Edward turned away, unable to let the trembling in his jaw be seen. Salt wind whipped against his face. From the battlements, Calais looked like a dying candle, its light meek, flickering. He felt like a man holding 2 realms, each bleeding between his fingers. That night, he dreamed of storms, black waves rising over England, tolling bells swallowed by water, and far in the distance a throne half drowned. When he woke, sweat tangled in his hair despite the chill. He rose and walked to the outer rampart, where a torch sputtered weakly in the wind. To his surprise, he found the Prince of Wales already there, armor half donned, face turned toward the dark horizon. "You heard," Edward said. "Yes, London suffers, and we are not there." A quiet accusation trembled beneath the words. Edward stepped beside him. For a moment, they simply watched the waves break against the shore. "I think about home every hour," Edward said softly. "But I must think as a king, not a father." "And what does a king see?" the prince asked. "A kingdom in 2 halves," Edward answered. "One here, at Calais, our foothold, our future in France, and one across the water, sick and desperate. 2 shadows," he murmured, "each threatening to swallow the other." Edward almost smiled, though there was no humor in it. "You must learn this," he said. "A crown is not a shield. It is a burden of choices that have no mercy." The prince looked away, jaw clenched. "When will we return?" "When England needs a king, more than Calais needs one. Not before." Calais became an island of uneasy refuge. Soldiers dug trenches against disease as much as against any enemy. Fires burned day and night to purify the air. Edward enforced strict cleanliness, no small act for an army, and isolated any man who so much as coughed. The French watched from afar, but did not strike. Their lands were as ravaged as England's. Rumor said Philippe VI rarely left his chambers, haunted by the knowledge that he had lost not only a battle, but the confidence of his realm. 2 kings, 1 war, 1 plague. The world seemed to teeter between them. By midsummer, new ships arrived from England. Some carried fresh troops, others carried only grim news. The plague still raged. London was quieter than it had ever been. Philippa continued to hold the court together, but the strain showed in every letter. Edward read them by candlelight, the flame trembling like the fear in his own heart. He was king of England. He was claimant to France, and yet he commanded neither storm, neither sickness, neither fate. He felt a strange kinship with his rival across the Channel, another monarch pacing in a shuttered chamber, hearing only the tolling bells of funerals. And when the plague finally loosened its grip, Edward knew the survivors of both realms would look to their rulers not with hope, but with the hard, questioning eyes of those who had learned how fragile kings were. The war for France was far from over, but the world that would fight it was not the same. A new age was coming, one born of death, desperation, and the thin resilience of nations brought to their knees. Edward III straightened, breathing in the salt air of Calais. When the plague receded, kings would rise again, and he intended to be at the front of that resurrection.
Dawn crept over the vineyards of Poitiers in a smear of pale gold, illuminating fields torn by hooves and churned by marching boots. The air hung heavy with the scent of trampled grapes, dust, and the metallic promise of blood. On a low ridge north of the city, Edward's eldest son, the Black Prince, watched the French host assemble like a swelling tide. Banners of blue and gold fluttered in the early breeze. Trumpets wailed. The very ground seemed to tremble beneath the weight of France rising to reclaim its pride. The prince exhaled slowly. They outnumber us 5-1. Sir John Chandos, standing at his shoulder, nodded grimly. Aye, my lord, but numbers are not destiny. You proved that at Crécy. Crécy was my father's field. This one is mine. He did not say the rest, and if I fail here, the legend dies with me. Across the valley, King Jean II of France, Jean the Good, rode among his armies, exhorting his knights. Unlike Philippe VI before him, Jean was no coward. He was a warrior king, armored in gleaming steel, his helmet crowned with the fearsome crests of France. His sons rode beside him, noble and ready. He had come to crush the English once and for all. The prince studied the French lines. Their cavalry milled impatiently, eager to charge. Their infantry massed in layered formations, their numbers vast, their confidence absolute. They think us cornered, the prince said. Chandos smiled faintly. We are, but a cornered wolf bites hardest. The prince's gaze traveled over the English position, a narrow rise bordered by hedges and thick scrub. Behind the hedge line, the longbowmen waited like coiled serpents, stakes planted, bows waxed. The men-at-arms stood in compact blocks, faces resolute. A perfect defensive nest, if they held their nerve. Morning mist rolled through the valley as the French advanced. The first wave, mounted knights, gathered pace, descending toward the English with lances lowered and armor gleaming. The prince stepped forward, raising his hand. Archers, he called, mark your men. Bowstrings tightened. Loose! A storm of arrows soared upward, blotting out the sun for a heartbeat. They fell with a shriek into the charging mass. Horses reared and crashed. Knights toppled like felled oaks. The charge faltered, then dissolved into chaos.
The French infantry pressed forward next, shields raised, crossbow bolts trailing. Again the prince raised his arm. Again the sky darkened. But this time Jean ordered his crossbowmen to fire in disciplined volleys. Bolts hissed into the hedges. English archers cried out, some falling, some wounded. The prince felt the pressure tightening like a vice. "Hold," he commanded. "Hold the hedge." Men-at-arms braced their shields. Longbows continued their deadly rhythm, but the French mass thickened, pushing up the slope despite losses. Jean himself was closing in. A sudden shout from the left flank. "My lord," Chandos called, "the French are pushing around the marsh." The prince moved at once, riding along the line. He saw it instantly, a cluster of French men-at-arms slogging through a shallow marsh he'd taken care to leave unguarded. Exactly where he wanted them. The prince signaled, "Archers, shift left." The longbowmen surged like a tide, repositioning. They fired at point-blank range into the trapped French, arrows punching through armor softened by mud and confusion. Bodies fell into the marsh, staining it a deeper red. Chandos grinned. They took the bait. The prince allowed himself the smallest smile. And they will take another. A roar erupted from the French center as Jean committed his elite knights. The charge was slower this time, more deliberate. Shields lifted to protect against arrows. The prince watched them grind forward, their formation tightening. "Now," he whispered. He signaled his Welsh infantry. They surged from behind the hedge, screaming their battle cries, striking the French before they could deploy fully. The two lines crashed together with bone-shaking force. Steel rang, men screamed, horses thrashed. The French advance stalled, but did not break. Jean himself pushed forward with terrifying resolve. He could see him now, a power of steel swinging a heavy battle-axe with brutal precision. English men-at-arms fell before him like wheat before the scythe. The prince's pulse quickened. "He's driving straight for our center," Chandos warned. "Then the center must not break." He spurred his horse and plunged into the heart of the melee. What followed was chaos made flesh. The prince carved a path through the French, his sword rising and falling in precise arcs. A knight lunged at him. He parried, twisted, struck. Another charged. He ducked beneath the swing, drove his blade upward into the man's ribs. Mud splashed his visor, blood slicked his gauntlets, but he did not waver. He would not falter. Not here. Not today. His household guard closed around him, shields locking, blades flashing. Chandos appeared at his side, face streaked with dirt and crimson. "The left holds," Chandos called. "The right is pushing them downhill." "And the center," the prince replied. "Strained, but standing." The prince lifted his voice so his men could hear him. "Push for England!" A cheer rose, ragged but defiant. The French line began to buckle. For the first time, King Jean hesitated. His men fell back. His knights were dying in droves, but he refused to retreat. "My sons," he roared, "with me!" They rallied around him, the last unbroken column of French nobility. They charged the English center in a desperate, final push. The shock was brutal. The prince felt the impact through his entire body. He fought like a man possessed, every instinct honed, every movement deadly. But the French were fierce, driven by pride and desperation. Chandos seized the prince's arm. "My lord, you're surrounded." The prince looked around. He was, in every direction, blue and gold pressing tight. "Then we stand," he said. And they did. Minute by minute, the French momentum ebbed. Men fell, horses collapsed, the press loosened. The cacophony faded into a scattered struggle. At last, surrounded by English soldiers, King Jean II lowered his sword. "I yield," he said, his voice hoarse but unbroken.
to the Prince of Wales. Silence rippled across the battlefield. The prince stared, chest heaving, as the enormity of what had happened settled upon him. He had captured the King of France. The war, the throne, the future, all shifted in an instant. Chandos stepped forward, voice reverent. "My lord, Poitiers is yours." The prince removed his helmet. His face was streaked, smeared, exhausted, but his eyes blazed with a new certainty. "No," he said softly. "Poitiers is England's." And with the fall of the French king, the boy who fought at Crécy became something more, a symbol, a legend, the heir to an empire forged in fire.
The storm that lashed the roofs of Westminster that night seemed almost intent on tearing the palace stones apart. Rain hammered the leaded windows. Wind howled against the great hall doors. Edward III stood alone beneath the flickering torchlight, staring at a map of France spread across an oaken table. His conquests marked in ink, his ambitions marked in scars. Yet, for the first time in years, the map did not thrill him. It mocked him. For though Poitiers had delivered him the greatest trophy a king could hope for, the living, breathing King of France as prisoner, the victory had also left a shadow he could not dispel. War had consumed 2 decades of his reign. His treasury cracked like old leather. Factions stirred beneath him. The Black Death still smoldered in the corners of Europe. And the burden of governing 2 kingdoms, one fully his, one partially his, and both unstable, pressed upon him like a millstone. Tonight, Edward felt older than his 50 years. He gripped the table edge as the wind keened through the corridor. "France bends, but does not break," he murmured. A distant voice replied, startling him. "No kingdom breaks easily, not even one defeated twice." Sir Walter Manny stepped from the shadows, water dripping from his cloak. He bowed, but his eyes revealed a concern he seldom allowed himself to show. "The council meets at sunrise," Manny said. "They are restless. Peace terms stall. Parliament groans under taxes. And—" He hesitated. "And," Edward pressed, "your son commands more loyalty from the lords than any man since Henry of Monmouth." The mention struck him deeper than he wished to admit. The Black Prince, his jewel, his pride, shone too brightly. Fresh from Poitiers, adored by soldiers, praised by chroniclers, and whispered about in every hall of England. Some even murmured that he, not the king, had won France. Edward forced a thin smile. "Good. Let them love him." Manny held his silence. Both men knew the truth. Love could build a throne or topple one. The next morning, the council chamber swelled with unease. Lords wrapped in damp cloaks argued in low, heated tones. The captured French king, Jean II, sat under gentle guard, dignified despite his captivity, and watched the English fracturing with a keen, tired gaze. Treasurer William Eddington spoke first. "Sire, we bleed gold faster than armies. The ransom for King Jean, astronomical. The promises to Aquitaine, impossible. The people are exhausted." "I have given them victory," Edward countered. "Victory demands sacrifice." "Sacrifice they have already given," the treasurer said quietly, "and more than enough." Murmurs of agreement rippled down the table. Edward felt heat rising in his chest. "You speak as though the crown crumbles." Another voice rose, one he did not expect. It was Jean II of France. "Your Majesty," the French king said gently, "even a victor may lose the peace
if he demands too much?" Edward stared at him. A prisoner offering advice? Jean smiled faintly. France resists, not because she is strong, but because she is wounded. Wounds breed rage. Rage breeds rebellion. You seek to rule a kingdom in pain. Be wary. A king who grasps for everything may hold nothing. The silence that followed was deep. Edward dismissed the council, but the words followed him like ghosts. Later that afternoon, Edward found the Black Prince practicing with his household knights in the inner yard. The clang of steel echoed beneath the gray sky. The prince moved with a deadly grace, faster, sharper, more deliberate than any man of his age. When he removed his helm, black hair clung to his damp brow, and the same fire that burned at Crécy and Poitiers burned still in his eyes. "Father," he greeted, drawing a deep breath, "a messenger from Gascony arrived. The rebels there request more troops." "Rebels always request more troops," Edward replied, though not with malice. "A kingdom is not won by sword alone, Edward." The prince smiled faintly. "But a crown is protected by one." His confidence was unshakable, his assurance absolute. Edward envied him, even as he feared for him. "Come," the king said, "walk with me." They strolled along the parapets overlooking the Thames. The river roared beneath them, swelling with rain. "Your victories," Edward began carefully, "have made you beloved." The prince inclined his head. "I serve England, and you. Yet service sometimes demands restraint. You chase glory too fiercely." The prince laughed softly. "Is that not what you taught me? That a king's duty is to carve his destiny, not wait for it." Edward closed his eyes, momentarily pierced by a truth he did not wish to face. He had taught him that, and now the lesson had returned, sharpened. "The weight of a crown," Edward said quietly, "is heavier than the sword that wins it." The prince stopped walking. "And yours grows heavier," he said, studying his father's lined face. "I see it." Edward looked away. The river surged. Thunder rolled. "Yes," he whispered, "it does." 2 weeks later, news arrived that shook the realm. Riots in London, merchants refusing royal levies, a noble faction in York openly denouncing the king's taxation, and more troubling still, rumors that certain lords sought to petition Parliament to limit the king's power, to force Edward into concessions he would never willingly accept. Manny delivered the report grimly. "The crown fractures. Even victory cannot bind it." Edward clenched his fists. "I have given them triumph, land, glory. Why do they turn from me now?" "Because triumph fills stomachs with pride, but hunger empties them," Manny said. That night, Edward walked the quiet halls of Westminster. Every torch cast long shadows. Every footstep echoed like judgment. He passed the chamber where Jean II slept, guarded, yet comfortable. A prisoner, yet with more unity in his kingdom than I have in mine. He passed the prince's rooms. Laughter drifted from within, youthful, vigorous, confident. The future lives there, Edward thought, and the past lives here. By midwinter, his health faltered. Fatigue clawed at him. The weight of armor, once nothing, now ached in his bones. His knights whispered that age had found him at last. During a fevered night, he dreamed of Crécy, of arrows cutting the sky, of the prince surrounded by enemies. He reached for his son, and found only smoke. Then Calais, gaunt faces, begging hands, and then a throne room made of cracked stone, the crown slipping from his grasp. He awoke, breathless, drenched in sweat. Manny and the prince rushed to his side, but Edward waved them off. "I am not dying." But in his heart, he feared something else, that his kingdom was. On the first clear morning of spring, Edward stood on the battlements alone. The Thames sparkled weakly. Bells tolled across London. The world looked steady, even serene. But he felt the tremor beneath it all. A kingdom stretched thin, a prince rising faster than the king could guide him, a French ransom draining the treasury, a war that refused to end, and a crown whose weight grew heavier with every victory, not lighter. "The crown crumbles," he whispered, "but not yet, not while I stand." He placed his hand on the cold stone, and the wind carried a scent of change, unavoidable, unstoppable.
Winter settled upon Windsor like an old, familiar sorrow, softening the stone walls in a veil of frost and quiet. Edward III sat beside the tall window of his private chamber, the fire crackling low behind him. The keep's shadows stretched long and thin across the floor. Age had carved deep lines into his once youthful face. The same hands that had held England's fate, shaped its armies, and bent France to his will, now trembled faintly when he closed them. He could feel the weight of years in his bones, the weight of victories won and sons buried. Outside, the wind moaned like a distant battlefield. "Strange," he murmured to no one. "A king spends a lifetime commanding storms, only to be conquered by the quiet." He leaned back, letting the memories come. They were sharper now than the world before him, ghosts with clearer faces than the living. Crécy, Poitiers, Calais, and the Black Prince, his radiant son, glorious, unstoppable, beloved by the realm. The boy who should have been king. Edward felt the old wound reopen, slow and deep. "My lion," he whispered, eyes closing. "Why did God take you first?" It had been years since England had truly felt like his. His body had betrayed him, his mind wandering between clarity and fog, but the memory of the Black Prince's death never faded. The kingdom had mourned as though the sun itself had been extinguished. Edward had been left with a void no crown could fill. And now, as winter tightened its grip, the realm grew restless again. France stirred, factions whispered. His grandson, young Richard, was untested. Parliament grew bold, fractious, hungry. He had held a storm at bay all his life, but storms, like kings, could not last forever. Footsteps broke the stillness. A woman's soft figure approached. Alice Piers, his companion in old age, though not his love. Love had been Philippa's alone, long gone now, taken by the same plague that had scarred an era. "You should rest, my lord," Alice said gently. I smiled faintly. "If I rest, I fear I may not wake." "Then sleep in the warmth, not by this cold window." He looked past her toward the fields beyond Windsor, white, quiet, endless. Once those fields had echoed with the laughter of his children, with training swords clashing, with the rallying cries of young knights dreaming of glory. Now they lay still, as though waiting for him to release his final hold on them. "No," he said softly, "let me stay. A king should watch over his kingdom, even at the end." Alice hesitated, but bowed and withdrew. He felt the cold creep further into his hands. Later, a shuffle of armored boots entered the room. Edward turned his head, and warmth touched his heart. Henry Percy, William Montague, old companions, white-haired now, but still loyal as the day they'd followed him into Flanders. Men who had lived through the fire of his ambitions and survived to see him fade. "My brothers," Edward rasped with a smile, "I wondered how long it would take for you to track me down.
Percy laughed, a deep, rolling sound with a crack in it. "Sire, you've never been hard to find. Just follow the drafts in the castle. You always choose the coldest room." "Habit of campaign," Edward said. Montague stepped forward. "The council fears your illness worsens." Edward waved a dismissive hand. "The council fears everything. That is its nature." "England fears losing you," Montague said quietly. There it was, the truth no one dared speak aloud. Edward looked at the two men who had grown old beside him in the long shadow of war. "Do you remember Crécy?" Percy smiled. "I remember the rain and the smell. God's misery, that smell." Montague chuckled. "And your boy, charging through the mud like the devil had loosed him himself." Edward closed his eyes. Warmth, grief, and pride swelled inside him in equal measure. "He was more than I ever was," he whispered. "More than England ever deserved." Silence followed, a respectful silence, a heavy one. Percy finally spoke, voice low. "He lives through his son, sire. Young Richard carries your blood, your fire." Edward shook his head faintly. "Richard carries the Black Prince's blood, but fire is learned, not inherited." He stared into the flames behind him, watching them flicker, fade, flare again. "What lesson did my reign teach, I wonder?" Montague answered without hesitation. "That England is not a prize, it is a destiny, one you forged with your own hands." Percy nodded. "You are Edward III, the hammer of France, the father of the English tongue, the king who reshaped the world." "There will never be another like you," Montague finished. The old king felt tears burn behind his eyes. He whispered, "Then let England endure without me." Night fell. Edward drifted in and out of sleep, the fire crackling softly. He dreamed, not of crowns, not of battles, but of Philippa's soft smile, of his children's laughter, of the Black Prince riding beside him, armor gleaming beneath the summer sky. When he woke again, the room felt different, quieter in a deeper, final way. He sensed he was alone. He sensed it was time. Edward pushed his hands against the armrests of his chair, forcing himself upright, straightening his spine with the stubbornness that had carried him through 50 years of rule. His breath trembled, but his eyes cleared. He looked out the window one last time. Snow drifted gently across the fields, covering the land in white peace. England, his England, calm, fragile, waiting for the dawn. A warmth settled over him, unexpected yet welcome. "I have been a king," he whispered, "and a man, and a father." His hand fell to the lion crest carved into the arm of his chair. "The last lion," he breathed. His eyes softened. And Edward III, King of England, conqueror, builder, dreamer, took his final breath, silent as slow falling, while the fire behind him guttered low, casting the faint shape of a roaring lion on the cold stone wall.